Make a Hi, everybody. We're going to pick up where we left off a few minutes ago. This was a problem on my end. I lost power right as King Crocoduck was about to describe his friend's reaction to his proposed experiment to verify the status of oppression. So Crocoduck, I don't know if you want to pick up from there or what, but that's where I got booted.
Well, anyway, long story short, her reaction wasn't very happy. She didn't really like the idea of, categorizing oppression, sort of ranking people based on how oppressed they were. She thought it was very crass. And this and other experiences with people in the feminist studies department gave me the distinct impression that feminist theory isn't really that interested in actually testing its models. I mean, it's happy to collect data and, say, okay, this data supports the theory.
Mm-hmm.
You need to create the model from the data. And then once you do that, you need to collect more data to see if that model needs to predict the future data. That's kind of how it's supposed to go. And it doesn't seem to really follow that route. It follows a more, okay, here's the model that I came up with, and here's the data to support it. And I think that that's something that a scientific realist would definitely object to.
Well, I will say for my part, if I would be very interested to learn about the results of such an experiment, like from the perspective of from where I sit, like if someone proposed doing that kind of a study and the way you described it in a very double-blind sort of way, so that you would account for all possible biases, I would be very interested to learn the results of that. Especially if it were done as you suggested, if it were repeated on a very large scale, so you could have sort of a collection of results that you could come to some conclusions about. Exactly. I would not have a huge problem with that. But
yeah, I believe you, Steve. It just seems that academic feminism wouldn't agree with us on this point.
Well, and what I will say in addition to that is I feel this way with a lot of feminist thought, is I can understand why people would have a problem with it. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with them not believing in the principle of falsifiability, or believing that, their models or their philosophies ought to be above criticism or above falsifiability. I think it comes more from a frustration with many people who seem to be incredibly skeptical and incredibly reluctant to believe things which to them are self-evidently obvious. And I respect your desire to have hard data. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think that would only help, if we had hard scientific data to be able to say, okay, people in these groups turned out to be the ones most experiencing oppression, and we had, concrete numbers to back that up. I don't think that would be a problem. But I'm sympathetic to people who sort of bang their heads against the wall when someone basically says citation needed, when they're talking about a form of oppression that is so widespread and so widely experienced. And this is something that when I say in my feminism video that I posted a few weeks ago, that one of the problems with the response to feminists speaking out in atheist circles, particularly on YouTube, is what I referred to as pedantic demands for evidence of even mundane and routine claims. The point of me saying that wasn't to reject the entire idea of basing your conclusions on evidence, as some people seem to think. The point was to not treat claims of women being oppressed the same way we treat claims of people being abducted by aliens. That it's not, in and of itself, it is not so outrageous of a claim that we should withhold our belief or our judgment until we have done comprehensive scientific surveys. Now, I'm not saying, as I say, I would love to see those surveys done. Actually, my friend Christy Winters, who is a social scientist and is someone I've collaborated with videos on in the past and is a feminist, she has suggested that it would be a great thing if somebody did a survey kind of like the one you describe of atheists, in order to determine how widespread certain attitudes within the atheist community are. Because the atheist community, by people outside of the atheist community, is often characterized as being, you know, very, very male dominant, very sexist, very hostile to feminism. And perhaps those attitudes are not that widely held in the atheist community. Perhaps it is a relative few people who are promoting those attitudes. And in fact, most atheists don't feel that way.
Well, Steve, and I would caution. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Jump in here real quick. I would caution against characterizing anti-feminism as sexism.
Oh, well, then we're just going to have to disagree with that. We're just going to have to disagree on that because.
Well, I mean, when you get down to it, feminism is an ideology. It's a way of looking at the world. Whether it's correct or not is a matter, I think, that is open to debate, open to discussion, and particularly given things like, for example, standpoint theory and the criteria of falsifiability, and to what extent, you know, feminist theory is willing, you know, to compromise on these matters. I think there is room for discussion on this matter. There is room for disagreement, and that it shouldn't really constitute sexism. Now, I have no doubt that people who are sexist against women are not fans of feminism, but I would hesitate to call people who aren't fans of feminism sexists.
Okay, I'll go with you this far. I'll go with you this far. I will admit that in principle, they are not the exact same thing. And I will admit that in theory, it would be possible for a person to be a non-feminist or even an avowed anti-feminist without also being a sexist. But in practice, I find that those two are almost always cohabitating. Even in people who insist that they aren't sexists, even in people to whom it seems very important that they not be thought of as sexists, just as there are people who would hate the thought that they were being thought of as racist, but nonetheless exhibit racist attitudes. I feel like if you say that you have a problem with feminism, and in most cases, it's not as finely tuned as the problems that you've been discussing with me today. In many cases, it's, as I said earlier before we got cut off, that they have a problem with the very notion that women are oppressed. And that may not be willful sexism. That may not be sexism on the part of someone who intends to mistreat women or discriminate against women, but that indicates a blindness to the plight of women that, for all intents and purposes, is sexist. If a man is simply ignorant or apathetic toward the oppression of women, that to me is sexist in a different way, but in just this, but practically speaking, the result is the same. You have someone who just either doesn't know, doesn't want to know, or doesn't care about the oppression of a group of people.
Or maybe they disagree. I mean, it seems very strange to me that a person could be a sexist by accident.
Do you think that a person can be racist by accident?
Well, a person can act in a racist manner by accident, but does that necessarily make them a racist? I mean, if you steal something once in your life, are you a thief? Are you?
Right. It comes down to the way we use the terms, and I admit that if you define sexist as being someone who willfully, you know, exhibits or you know, indulges in sexist behavior or attitudes, then not everybody I'm describing as a sexist is a sexist. But sexism, like racism, I think is something that exists both in ways that the people who hold those ideas are very conscious of, and also in ways that people may not be aware of. I mean, there are implicit biases that I think it is fair to describe as sexist.
Well, I think we might have to disagree on this point, Steve.
You don't think there are implicit biases that are sexist?
Racist. I'm at right now. I'm at Isla Vista.
Right.
I am literally a 2 minutes walk away from where a person who I would definitely consider misogynist, among other things,
Right.
slaughtered innocent people. You know, this is not something that's foreign to me. I lived it. I take accusations of sexism and misogyny very seriously. You must understand. There's a higher bar that I set on these matters. When it comes to simply disagreeing as to the need for feminism or the extent to which women are oppressed, I really have a very difficult time to characterize such behaviors as sexist. But you know, that's just my opinion.
Right. Well, like I say, there are different ways of using the term, and I do think it is possible, and I will admit that not everybody who could be described as anti-feminist necessarily has their heart in the wrong place. I don't think that all of them necessarily mean harm to women. I think that they may honestly be proceeding from what they consider to be a realistic basis. But I don't think when you look at the way women are treated in our culture versus the way men are treated, and for someone to say that sexism or misogyny are not issues that affect, that women are not oppressed far more often and far more seriously than men, and or that the need for feminism must first be scientifically demonstrated in order for us to really take it seriously. I wonder what world you're living in. And the problem that people like me have is it's very difficult to cross that barrier. It's very difficult when someone says, prove to me the sky is blue. How exactly do you do that other than pointing to the sky? And if you point to the sky and they say, well, that's not blue, that's red, you're kind of at an impasse. Because,
well, I don't mean to sound glib, but you could, you know, measure the wavelengths. But, I see where you're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, if someone looks at what I see as blue and they say, well, that's red, you know what I'm saying? There's not a whole lot I can do. And even if I show them the wavelengths, they might say, well, yeah, it's red, you know?
Well, you can agree, okay, the wavelengths are this many nanometers versus that many nanometers.
Right, but what if to them that's what is defined? What I'm saying is, and this is a lot of where I think the problem with people who ask specific individuals in this debate for evidence. When someone asks, like say someone comments on a video I've done and says, well, what's the evidence for whatever, you know, like let's say I'm talking about a very general topic like rape culture. Say, what's the evidence for rape culture? I can explain what I mean by rape culture, and I can point out various studies that establish that principles of rape culture, concepts of rape culture actually exist.
I just do wish. I understand. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Jump in really quickly. I understand what is meant by rape culture, but I do wish that it was given a name that wasn't so loaded with emotion.
What is there a term you would prefer?
I can't think of any right now, but I don't think rape culture is the appropriate thing to call it. But anyway, go ahead. That's this. I just wanted to give my 2 cents.
My problem with the term isn't so much that it's emotionally loaded, is that it tends to be misleading, because people who don't know what it actually means, or who don't know how it is usually used, tend to think that you're referring to that a culture is either a rape culture or is not, you know. And since rape is illegal in this country, therefore we can't have a rape culture. And that's not exactly how the term is used. But I don't have a problem with it being emotionally loaded. I think it refers to attitudes that that lead to the normalization and the condoning of rape. So I don't know what else you're going to call it. Or at the very least, I would object to the term culture, not necessarily the term rape. But my point is,
Sorry.
Yeah. No, go.
Normalization. I can see the concern there, because we do say, all right, rape is going to happen, murder is going to happen, theft is going to happen. You know, the best we can do is just learn how to live with this sort of thing. But condoning, I
Oh, I think you cut out again. Or was that me? Boy, we were just having. Yeah, did you cut out right after condoning? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Normalization. I can see the potential for concern there, but condoning it seems a little bit too far, don't you think? I mean, I don't.
Well,
I don't know who's actually condoning it other than sociopaths.
but what about tacitly condoning it?
What does that mean?
Well, let me draw an analogy. I've been thinking a lot in the last few days about gun culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even though I think most people, when asked the question, would say that they have a big problem with, things like mass shootings or gun violence in general, or gun deaths in general. Like, nobody wants to say, oh, well, I just don't care. Everybody, when confronted with the problem, everybody cares. But nothing is ever really done about it. Nothing is ever really changed. So while I wouldn't say that we as individuals or even as communities willfully condone the appalling amount of gun violence in the United States, I would say that we as a country can be said to have tacitly condoned it. Because even though when asked about it, we might say, oh no, it's a horrible problem, when push comes to shove, we don't actually really do anything about it. Our actions don't show that we think it's important. And I think you can draw an analogy to the cultural norms and the attitudes that are collectively referred to as rape culture. We might say, oh, of course, rape is a terrible thing. Nobody wants rape. But then, but in practice, we often show that we don't really think it's that it's that important.
I think it's a little bit flimsy, but I won't challenge the point. I've interrupted you enough. You were going to make a point about...
What was I going to make a point about? Well, I was talking about, let me see. I was talking about evidence. I was talking about how it's difficult to prove something to someone when they have just a completely different view of the playing field than you do. Like trying to prove the sky is blue to someone who insists that it's red. But I think my larger point is just that treating gender inequality and treating the oppression of women as though this is something that the jury is still out about is a problem to me. And if people want to really plant their feet and insist that, well, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves on this gender inequality thing, they may honestly be trying to just be skeptical and to be careful. But to me, the practical difference between that and a more willful, aggressive kind of sexism is negligible. I think that it both leads to negative effects, for women in particular and for our society in general.
All right. Well, we're coming to the close at this point.
Yeah.
So I want to finish by saying something that's probably going to upset you. That is, I think you have more in common than you would like to acknowledge, or even to yourself, with Sargon of Akkad. I've been watching both of quite a few of your videos, and I noticed the two of you, even though you disagree on this issue, I think the two of you and ground. I would be very interested to see a conversation play out between you two. Nothing combative, not like a debate type, just a conversation like you and I have been having. Right. For anyone who thinks, me and Steve, we're not going back and forth with this like there's no like debate going on here. We're just talking about this issue. I think if you had a similar talk with Sargon, you know, whatever your disagreements, I think the two of you could perhaps come to terms. I think it would be healthy.
Okay, well, I would caution you not to hold your breath. That is not ever going to happen, and I'll explain why. The reason I wanted to have this conversation with you is, first of all, because I'm really glad we did this, by the way. I had a really great time doing this, and I think it was, you know, I appreciated that you had a sort of a different approach to it, that you wanted to talk about the epistemologies that underlie the various points of view. I think that was a really interesting way to go about it, that isn't really talked about very often. You know, like you said in the one of the original messages you sent me about this, it wasn't just us throwing our opinions at each other, although we did a little bit of that, but it was mostly, you know, trying to get at why people come to these conclusions in the first place. And I think that was interesting. And I think that's something that hasn't really been done very much. So that's a reason I wanted to do this with you. The other reason is that I didn't get the impression that you wanted to do this because you were interested in grandstanding. And that is all I think Sargon is interested in doing. And you might disagree with me on that. You clearly have more respect for him than I do. But the impression I get from Sargon and from all of the little sort of, you know, junior Thunderfoot Brigade, Teal Deer will be another one, that they're far more interesting in using feminism in particular, but there are other issues as well. Feminism in particular as a means of grandstanding for a particular portion of their audience. And I'm not interested in participating in that. And I'm sure that you're right, that if Sargon and I got together and just talked as just two people and had a friendly conversation, I'm sure that would be possible. And I'm sure we might find that we have things in common. You know, I'm sure we could get along with each other. But I am not interested in doing that. I don't think that Sargon's point of view on feminism is valid or respectable. You disagree with me on that, but that's just the conclusion I've come to about that. And I am not interested in indulging him or what to me are his childish requests for debates in which I have shown no interest at all, and yet he continues to pursue these requests. I'm not interested in that, and I'm not interested in participating in his attempt to continue to grandstand to his audience and win cheap applause from the sexists and the misogynists who hoot and cheer him on whenever he talks shit about feminism. I'm just not interested in taking part in that. I don't think that's what we have done in this video. I think this has actually been a friendly and informative conversation. Even though I've disagreed with a lot of what you had to say, I think we've had a pretty good conversation.
I agree. The most productive conversations. Sorry, the most productive conversations are the ones, you know, they're not inside of echo chambers. You know, this room is definitely not an echo chamber.
Of course not. And I, like I say, even though I've disagreed with a lot of what you have to say, we have also had points of agreement. You know, I think your proposed your study, your experiment is something that I would actually be interested to see the results of if somebody did that. But, you know, I don't think this conversation was about either of us trying to score points off the other one. And even though I don't think this is how you see it, the way I see it is that's all that Sargon is interested in doing. And I just don't think a debate between me and him, or even a discussion between me and him, would be all that fruitful, because he is one of those guys who I think just rejects the basic notion that feminism is necessary, at least in the West. I mean, he might say, well, there's certain parts of the world, you know, where women have it really bad, but here in the West, they have it better than men. I don't buy that. And if that is someone's position, I mean, I vehemently disagree with that, but I'm not really interested in wasting my time trying to persuade them otherwise. Because what am I going to say? I mean, honestly, what am I going to say that he hasn't already heard? You know?
Well, you don't have to if you don't want to. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. Hey, it's your opinion, your channel. You do what you want.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I say, I appreciated this talk between us, but as far as me going on Sargon's channel or having him here, that's just never going to happen.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for having me on at least. I think this was a productive conversation.
I think so too. And I'm glad I mentioned at the beginning of the first half of this, before we got cut off, I mean, this was your idea. And I applaud you for coming up with it and for coming to me. I think it was a good conversation. You know, I hope everybody watching, we're back up to about 70 live viewers now, which is great. We were over 100 before we got cut off, which is really cool. So I hope everybody watching got something out of it, whatever side you might come in on, whoever you agree with in this. Because I do think it was productive, or at the very least it was enjoyable. And that's what I said before we went on the air. If it's not productive, at least it'll be enjoyable, you know? And we come out of it still, I think, still liking each other. You know,
I hope so.
Yeah. So, I mean, from my end, I can say that you don't seem too mad at me. So
no, I'm not mad. I'm just, soon as you press that red button on the top, I'm going to start hearing you yell at me. Gonna be,
you son of a bitch, how dare you? No, it's not gonna happen.
There's gonna be talks about mangina feminazis and fedora.
If we'd had our cameras on, I could have worn my sloppy mangina t-shirt, but alas, it was not to be. Anyway, so shall we wrap this up?
Sure. I just want to say, if there's anyone out there on the anti-feminist side who also wants to talk to me about these epistemologies, I would be interested in having a conversation like this. You know, nothing really one-sided. I'm going to try to remain as neutral as possible, as I have here. I like to think that, you know, being in STEM, I've learned how to sort of discipline the eye to be a conversation like this. So, yeah. And I want to thank you again, Steve, for having me on. This was fun.
Well, thank you again. Thank you for proposing it, and thank you for agreeing to have it on my channel. And thanks everybody for listening. And sorry about the interruption earlier, but hopefully you guys caught up with us. And yeah, this was fun. Thanks for watching, everybody.